The segment was supposed to be routine. A panel of lawmakers was invited onto a primetime network to discuss the growing concerns around the proposed education reform bill. Most expected talking points, statistics, polite disagreements. No one expected what would become the most talked about on-air moment of the year. Jasmine Crockett, known for her calm but sharp approach to debate, had been invited to the broadcast reluctantly. Producers weren't sure her style would generate the kind of attention they wanted. But what she delivered was far more explosive than any shouting match. 10 minutes into the segment, Donald Trump, who had made a surprise appearance via live feed, derailed the conversation. After a brief argument with the panel's host, he pivoted, his voice taking on that familiar boastful tone. Frankly, I don't think someone like Jasmine has any business talking about education. Look at her record. Look at her background. It's weak, not like Melania, who speaks 5 languages and understands diplomacy better than most of these so-called representatives. The jab wasn't just unnecessary. It was designed to land. A carefully veiled swipe crafted to dismiss, diminish, and reframe the conversation around pedigree and Polish. The panel grew tense. 2 of the Republican commentators chuckled awkwardly. One Democratic aide off camera could be seen blinking in disbelief. Jasmine, seated at the far right of the panel table, did not react. She didn't even blink. The host tried to move on. Let's focus on the policy. But Trump cut in again. This time louder. You've got someone on here who can't even run a decent office trying to talk about law. She doesn't have the class, the education, the grace of someone like Melania. It's embarrassing. The air grew heavy. Even the producers, watching from behind the soundproof glass, paused mid-cue. They were used to Trump throwing jabs, but rarely had he gone this far, attacking someone's education and comparing them directly to his wife on national TV. It was a bait, designed to provoke, meant to reduce the moment to outrage. And Jasmine Crockett still said nothing. What happened next was not a heated retort. It wasn't the kind of clapback the internet had grown used to. It was something far sharper, quieter, more deliberate, and ultimately far more cutting. As the host finally regained control and turned to Jasmine for her thoughts on federal oversight in education funding, her voice was calm. I've heard a lot about class and grace in education tonight, she began. So let me answer in the language that matters most, not in how many languages you speak, but in the truth behind what you say. The studio quieted. Trump was still on the feed, clearly annoyed she hadn't reacted to the insult. She continued, I went to law school not to look polished. I went because my mother cleaned houses so I could write briefs. I went because people in my community were punished by systems designed by people who believed decorum was more important than justice. The host tried to interject, but she held the space. Not with volume, but precision. Education isn't about how many languages you can repeat rehearsed phrases in. It's about how many truths you're willing to confront in the language of law, of equity, of service. And with all due respect to Melania, she may have studied languages. I studied constitutional violations. And no offense, but the people I represent care more about how a woman uses her education than how she poses with it. A pause. Just long enough for the air to shift. The Trump feed pixelated for a moment. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. The host looked off camera. Producers were signaling something. It was unclear whether to cut, continue, or intervene. But Jasmine wasn't finished. I've never hosted fashion galas or graced the cover of lifestyle magazines. But I've stood in courtrooms and fought for people who couldn't afford the lawyers Melania's friends hire for their pets. Gasps. Not laughter. Not applause. Just a collective intake of breath. Even one of the conservative panelists sat back slightly in his chair. A young intern backstage mouthed, "Oh my God," as the live stream exploded online. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, not to escalate, but to clarify. I'm not ashamed of where I came from. I'm not embarrassed that I learned to code switch, to survive, to climb. Because the truth is, grace isn't what you wear to a gala. It's what you choose not to say when you have every reason to. Trump cut in again, audibly rattled now. I think that's a very disrespectful thing to say about the First Lady, okay? Very disrespectful. She's done more for this country than you ever will. You've got no class. The panel froze. Jasmine looked directly at the camera. My class? I sat through my mother's chemotherapy treatments writing legal briefs on prison reform. I walked to school past eviction notices and wrote essays on housing discrimination. If that's not class, then maybe we need to redefine the word. Trump's feed went silent. Not cut, not censored. Silent. Either he had been muted by producers or had nothing left to say. But the damage, or revelation, was done. The clip began spreading before the show had even ended. Twitter/X blew up. TikTok users clipped the moment Jasmine referenced Melania's education, or lack thereof, and added captions like, "This isn't grace. It's grit, and education isn't a photo shoot." Within hours, the hashtag #GraceOfGrit trended nationwide. Commentators across networks divided fast. Conservative pundits blasted Jasmine's remarks as disrespectful, uncouth, and too personal. Liberal voices defended her, calling it the reckoning of the pedestal complex. One independent journalist tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just redefined what it means to be educated on live television." But it wasn't just political commentary that took off. Students, teachers, single moms, even young teens posted videos reacting to the clip. A Latina high school senior posted, "She spoke for all of us who didn't grow up pretty, rich, or poised, but smart, angry, and ready." The White House press secretary was asked the next morning whether the former First Lady would respond to Representative Crockett's comments. The answer was curt. The First Lady chooses not to dignify personal attacks, but that did little to stem the conversation. In fact, it made the silence feel even more telling. Fox News ran an edited version of the segment, cutting out Jasmine's references to courtrooms, chemotherapy, and her mother. CNN aired the full clip in its entirety, followed by a panel of women across party lines debating the meaning of grace and education in public life. A former Harvard law professor posted a scathing op-ed titled, "What Jasmine said wasn't about Melania. It was about the myth we sell young women," arguing that the controversy wasn't personal. It was cultural. That what Jasmine had done was challenge the metric by which we evaluate powerful women. 1 week later, a mural appeared in downtown Baltimore. Two figures, one on the left, one on the right. One held a designer clutch, the other a worn legal brief. In the middle, bold letters read, "Not everyone needs a translator. Some of us speak in verdicts." As the debate raged on, Jasmine Crockett didn't post on social media. No interviews, no clarifications. Just a single sentence 2 days after the broadcast. "Class isn't about image. It's about impact." The post was liked over 2.1 million times, reposted across platforms. Celebrities, authors, and even some Republican critics began quoting it, some to praise, others to condemn. But one thing was certain. Trump may have tried to mock her education, but what Jasmine said, or more accurately, how she said it, left a scar on the conversation that couldn't be covered in pearls or protocol. The moment hadn't just gone viral. It had metastasized. Within 48 hours, the political ecosystem had shifted its attention almost entirely to Jasmine Crockett and her now infamous on-air retort. What was supposed to be a spirited policy debate on federal education funding had turned into a cultural flashpoint. Conservative think tanks began publishing op-eds defending Melania Trump's education credentials, calling her the most misunderstood First Lady in modern history. One piece argued that Crockett had unfairly attacked a woman who never asked to be a political figure. Another accused Crockett of race baiting, class warfare, and intellectual elitism, a charge dripping in irony, considering the nature of Trump's original insult. But outside the Beltway and echo chambers, a different story was unfolding. In high schools, community colleges, grassroots organizations, even churches, people were talking about class, about merit, about who gets to define intelligence in America. One Sunday sermon from a South Side Chicago church echoed Crockett's words word for word. The Reverend paused halfway through, looked up at the congregation and said, "Tell me why it is that when a black woman speaks truth in clean, legal, educated English, it's called disrespect?" By Monday, Jasmine Crockett was trending again, not for what she said this time, but for what she refused to say. She had declined 4 major cable interviews: MSNBC, CNN, The View. Even Trevor Noah's new late-night show had reached out through back channels, but her office issued the same response. The Congresswoman is focused on legislative duties and constituent services. What most didn't know was that behind the scenes, things were boiling. In the days following the viral moment, the Trump team was in damage control mode. While Trump himself kept his public commentary relatively muted, privately, he was livid. Multiple sources close to Mar-a-Lago reported that he'd thrown his phone at a wall after a Fox host chuckled on air and said Jasmine had cut deeper than Melania's cheekbones. He demanded loyalty, demanded that every surrogate defend Melania with everything you've got. But something was different this time. There wasn't a script that worked. Crockett hadn't attacked Melania's looks or her past. She had attacked the very notion that grace and polish equaled substance. That's harder to spin. Melania herself was silent. Her social media remained full of garden photos, designer outfits, and cryptic reposts of nostalgic quotes. But the silence only made the contrast starker and more uncomfortable for Trump. And then, 3 days later, came the leak. A recording surfaced from a high-level GOP fundraising dinner held at a private club in Palm Beach. On it, a major Trump donor was heard saying, "Look, we love Melania, but this whole thing's a PR nightmare. That Crockett girl? She didn't just win a debate. She reframed the conversation. And we don't have an answer to that." The clip was short, but deadly. Suddenly, every right-wing pundit on cable TV was being asked the same question. Is there a double standard in how we treat educated women of color in politics? Some sidestepped, some doubled down, but none had a clear answer. The shift was happening not just in headlines, but in the psychology of the audience. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was dealing with something else entirely. The threats began almost immediately. Her office received over 800 voicemails in a single day, many filled with racial slurs, misogynistic venom, and coded threats. One caller repeatedly screamed, "You don't talk about the Queen like that," referencing Melania. Another calmly said, "Watch your step. You made enemies in high places." Her security detail was increased. Staffers were rotated. And still, she showed up to committee meetings, press briefings, and community events, her posture never flinching. But privately, her team was divided. Her communications director argued that it was time to go on offense. "You've got the moment. Use it," he urged. "Get out there. Tell your story. Don't let them define this." Her chief of staff disagreed. "This isn't a campaign moment," she cautioned. "It's a cultural one. And you already said everything that needed to be said. Don't dilute the power of the silence." Jasmine listened carefully, then said, "We'll do both, but we'll do it our way." 2 days later, without press or warning, Jasmine showed up to an underfunded high school in East St. Louis. Not for cameras, not for a speech, to sit with students, teachers, and parents, to talk about what education actually looks like when you're not on a TV stage. A photo leaked anyway. It showed her in a circle with 4 students, sleeves rolled up, a notebook in her lap. No makeup team, no staffers in frame, just her and the community she fought for. That image, raw, unscripted, human, was reposted by over 20 celebrities, including Viola Davis, Taraji P. Henson, and Ava DuVernay. Each added their own message about what class and grace truly mean. Back in Washington, the GOP was flailing. Multiple members of Congress began distancing themselves from Trump's original comments. Privately, some even admitted they felt uncomfortable with how Crockett had been targeted. One Republican congresswoman from Pennsylvania told a closed-door meeting, "We don't win the future by mocking education. especially not from women who've earned every inch of it. But Trump wasn't letting go. On Truth Social, he posted in all caps, "Jasmine Crockett is a disgrace to the House. She disrespected a wonderful, classy woman Melania WHO never said a bad word about her. Jealousy? Low IQ? WHO knows?" Within minutes, Jasmine's name was trending again. But this time, the response was colder, measured. People had seen this move before. The chaos, the insults, the projection. Jasmine responded only once. Again, not with words, but an image. She posted a photo of her original law school acceptance letter, overlaid with one line, "My credentials speak louder than your caps lock." It went viral instantly. Meanwhile, late-night comedians began weighing in. Seth Meyers joked, "Trump attacking a liar's intelligence is like me critiquing LeBron's jump shot." Jimmy Kimmel called it a battle between someone who studied the Constitution and someone who plagiarized a Michelle Obama speech. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about a jab on TV. It was about the collision between two Americas, one that believes power comes from image, and one that knows it's forged in struggle. By the end of the week, a student-run newspaper at Howard University published an op-ed titled, "We are all Jasmine Crockett now." It read, "They want us polished, quiet, decorative. But Jasmine reminded us that power isn't about grace, it's about grit. We don't have to fit into their mold to be brilliant. We don't have to bow to be heard. And when they try to reduce us to silence, we'll answer with substance." Even former critics began to walk back their takes. One conservative columnist admitted on air, "Maybe it's time we ask ourselves why Melania's silence is called elegance, but Jasmine's truth is called aggression." That line, clipped and reposted, became yet another signal that something deeper was happening, a conversation long overdue. And Jasmine Crockett, whether she wanted to or not, had become the public narrative seemed to be swinging toward Crockett. What was happening inside the halls of Capitol Hill was far more precarious. The Republican machine wasn't going to let her off the hook, not after embarrassing their figurehead and his family on such a public stage. The backlash grew more coordinated. House Oversight Committee members, particularly those loyal to Trump, began working behind the scenes to dig up anything they could use to discredit Crockett. One staffer leaked that opposition researchers were instructed to go through every case she touched as an attorney. Old court dockets, financial disclosures, social media from a decade ago. They wanted dirt, any kind. Crockett, knowing the game, wasn't fazed. "Let them look," she told her team. "They'll find receipts. That's all I ever kept." Meanwhile, right-wing influencers were in full swing. Tucker Carlson, now running his own independent media outlet, did a 25-minute segment titled, "The Crockett Illusion? Why Intelligence Isn't Loud." He argued that black women like Jasmine get praised for shouting, but if a white woman speaks softly, she's mocked as stupid. It was vintage Carlson, coded language wrapped in pseudo-intellectual logic. But the internet didn't let it slide. Within hours, thousands of black women responded with a viral thread titled, "Let's talk about who gets to be angry in America." One tweet read, "A black woman raises her voice. She's aggressive. A white man throws ketchup at the wall. He's passionate. You see the problem?" The cultural commentary intensified. Media panels, Twitter spaces, podcasts, all lit up with discussions on respectability politics, the weaponization of tone, and how black women in politics are disproportionately scrutinized for confidence. Even Ava DuVernay weighed in during a keynote speech at the Essence Women's Summit. She said, "What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just a comeback. It was a reclamation of voice, of space, of the right to not be diminished for knowing exactly who you are." The speech earned a standing ovation and was broadcast on YouTube to nearly 500,000 viewers within a day. Back in D.C., Trump's allies were preparing their counterattack. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene introduced a non-binding resolution formally condemning Crockett's remarks as demeaning and unbecoming of a member of Congress. It was purely symbolic. It had no legal weight, but it created a media circus nonetheless. A special session was held. Crockett, flanked by fellow progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley, showed up in a black blazer, no makeup, and a single pin on her lapel that read, "Educated." The GOP hoped she would apologize, or at least walk back her tone. Instead, Crockett asked to speak, and when given the floor, she delivered one of the most talked about speeches of the year. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but every syllable landed like a hammer. I will not be condemned for stating facts. Melania Trump plagiarized Michelle Obama's speech. That's not speculation. That's a documented, verified truth. I will not be told that calling out hypocrisy is an attack, and I will not apologize for reminding the American people that education is not a liability. It is a qualification. She looked each GOP member in the eye. You can pass as many resolutions as you want. What you won't do is rewrite history. You want decorum? Start with honesty. The chamber fell silent. Even some Republicans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What happened next was unprecedented. Instead of censoring her, the Democratic caucus filed a counter-resolution, praising Crockett for defending factual integrity and upholding the dignity of public service. The political stalemate turned into a symbolic victory for her side. Meanwhile, grassroots donations to her office surged. Small dollar donors from across the country, especially Black women, began contributing to her re-election campaign. A donation note that went viral read, "This is for every time we had to stay quiet in the meeting, in the courtroom, in the classroom, while someone dumber than us got to speak freely." The movement had gone beyond politics. It had entered culture. At a rally in Atlanta, a young girl held up a sign that read, "I want to be like Jasmine when I grow up." Crockett, fighting back tears, came down from the stage and hugged her. That image, a full circle moment of generational inspiration, appeared on the cover of several digital magazines within days. But Trump wasn't done. He doubled down on social media, now calling Crockett a disgrace to her race, and suggesting she should be investigated for ethics violations. The post, flagged for hate speech, was eventually removed from Instagram, prompting cries of censorship from MAGA circles. One of Trump's advisors reportedly begged him to stop attacking her. "You're only making her stronger," they warned. "You're turning her into a folk hero." But Trump couldn't help himself. For him, the loss of control over the narrative was the ultimate insult. Then came the unexpected turn. Melania Trump broke her silence. In an exclusive statement to a friendly publication, she said, "I have always carried myself with grace, and I believe in rising above negativity. I will not respond to those who seek attention through confrontation. I know who I am." It was vague, non-committal, designed to sound noble, but the reaction was mixed. While some applauded her, others saw through it. Political commentator Angela Rye said, "Notice how she never denies the plagiarism, never challenges the facts, just leans into image again, as if that's all we should care about." By now, Jasmine's name was part of a larger ecosystem. T-shirts bearing her quotes were sold in online stores. Memes turned her into an icon of resistance. Schools requested her for commencement speeches. Editorial boards began floating her as a future Senate candidate. Even Hollywood took notice. A limited docuseries was announced on a major streaming platform, exploring the lives of women like Crockett who disrupted the political system by refusing to play by old rules. Behind the scenes, though, she remained cautious. "This isn't about me," she told her team. "This is about the people who never get heard unless someone like me risks being loud." The backlash hadn't stopped. She still received threats, still dealt with coded smears in the press, still watched as panelists debated her tone more than her policy work. But her resolve had only hardened. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. During a press gaggle, a reporter asked President Biden what he thought of the Crockett-Melania exchange. He smiled, then said, "I think we've got a lot of strong women in Congress. Jasmine? She's one of the smartest, one of the toughest, and one of the truest voices we've got." That quote ran on headlines coast to coast. With that, Crockett wasn't just the face of a viral moment. She was officially part of the Democratic Party's rising bench, a voice impossible to ignore. And somewhere in Mar-a-Lago, Trump watched the news, his expression unreadable. The man who once dominated the media was now losing it, slowly, steadily, to a woman who had mastered the art of truth without shouting, force without threat, and intellect without apology. By the time Congress returned from recess, the Jasmine Crockett phenomenon had become something no strategist could have predicted, a cultural shift. Her clash with Trump had turned into a lens, one through which Americans were reevaluating everything from education to power, race to gender, image to authenticity. What had started as a viral exchange was now manifesting in policy. Behind closed doors, Crockett began drafting a sweeping new education initiative. It focused on underfunded schools in historically marginalized communities, expanding access to civics education, legal literacy programs, and federal scholarships aimed specifically at first-generation college students. "We're not just talking about credentials anymore," she told her policy team. "We're building them." This legislative move wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Crockett knew that to turn this media moment into a legacy, it had to be anchored in results. She was crafting something tangible, something that couldn't be erased with the next news cycle. Republicans, still smarting from the PR nightmare, had split into three camps. The first, the far-right loyalists, doubled down. They continued attacking Crockett's intelligence, her tone, her style. These were the usual suspects: Green, Boebert, and a handful of Fox News regulars. Their arguments were recycled, transparent, and increasingly disconnected from public sentiment. The second group, moderates from swing districts, began distancing themselves. Quietly, they stopped retweeting Trump. They stopped commenting on the Crockett story. Some even began attending bipartisan education meetings, ones they'd ignored before. But it was the third group that surprised everyone. A small but vocal number of younger Republicans, more libertarian-leaning, started speaking out in her defense. Not because they agreed with her politics, but because they understood the stakes. One rising GOP voice said on a podcast, "Look, I don't like her policies, but I'll be damned if we're going to pretend she's not smart." That's the problem with our party right now. We attack people personally when we can't win arguments. This shift didn't go unnoticed. Conservative Twitter exploded with infighting. MAGA influencers accused these moderates of selling out, but the narrative had already fractured. Meanwhile, Melania Trump had disappeared again. Her one statement hadn't helped. If anything, it had confirmed what many already believed, that Melania was still treating public perception as a fashion accessory, something to be polished, managed, and ultimately ignored if it stopped matching the outfit. Jasmine, by contrast, wasn't curating her image. She was expanding it. She gave her first full-length interview to a Black-owned digital news outlet. No flashy set, no stylists, no handlers. Just her, seated on a worn leather chair in a Texas radio studio, speaking slowly, plainly. "People are mad because I didn't whisper. But the truth doesn't whisper. It testifies. And sometimes the testimony is sharp because the truth got tired of being ignored." That quote alone got over 2 million impressions in 48 hours. Then came the email leak. An anonymous whistleblower from a conservative lobbying group released internal communications showing that multiple right-wing donors had asked elected officials to stop responding to the Crockett issue. "It's costing us suburban women in polling." Polling confirmed it. A new national survey showed Jasmine Crockett with 73% favorability among Black women, 62% among millennials, and most surprisingly, a 45% approval rating among white, college-educated suburban women. The data was clear. The people Trump thought would be offended by Crockett's words weren't offended at all. They were inspired. Even Michelle Obama, long silent on political day today matters, shared a cryptic post that week with a single sentence: "Sometimes, the truth cuts, but the wound it leaves is where the light gets in." No one had to ask who she was referencing. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Crockett made her move. She announced a bipartisan roundtable on the politics of credentialism and power. inviting members from both parties to sit down publicly and talk about how education, background, and identity were being used as weapons in American discourse. It was risky. These kinds of events rarely ended well. But Crockett understood the power of a well-staged conversation. And when the day came, she didn't just show up, she owned it. Seated across from representatives, community leaders, and even two Republican educators, she began with a quiet statement. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to challenge all of us to think about why it is that when a Black woman says something with clarity, we treat it like confrontation. Why a European accent is seen as class, and a Southern Black one as comedy. And why our kids grow up thinking they have to soften their brilliance to survive in certain rooms. There was no yelling, no gotcha moments, just clarity, courage, conversation. Cable news barely knew what to do with it. It didn't fit the template. But social media? It lit up. Clips from the roundtable became TikTok soundbites, Twitter threads, Reddit debates. One comment from a 19-year-old student went viral. She's not just speaking for herself. She's explaining us to a country that still pretends it knows what professionalism looks like. As the weeks rolled on, the Crockett effect only deepened. A national coalition of Black women leaders formed a pact, not for Crockett specifically, but for candidates who refused to apologize for being smart, prepared, and unapologetically themselves. College debate teams began analyzing her speeches. Law professors quoted her during lectures. High school civics teachers used the Crockett-Melania moment to explore double standards in American media. And while the Trump campaign continued with its usual bluster, rallies, merch, grievances, it became clear that they had missed the moment. Completely, they tried to mock Crockett. It backfired. They tried to silence her. It amplified her. They tried to bury her under backlash. She built policy out of it. And just when the storm seemed to settle, Crockett dropped one more hammer. She introduced a bill titled the Transparent Education Standards Act, requiring all public servants who discuss education policy to disclose their own educational background in official statements. It was a masterstroke, not because it had a chance of passing, though it did gain surprise support, but because it reframed the debate again. It wasn't about Melania anymore. It was about all of them. All the pundits, politicians, and power brokers who had spent decades sneering at the educated while secretly relying on consultants to write their speeches. Jasmine's message was simple. If you want to talk about education, show your work. The press called it performative, but the public called it refreshing. And as election season loomed, with Trump once again the likely Republican nominee and Democrats scrambling to energize their base, one thing was clear. Jasmine Crockett had become more than a congresswoman. She was a symbol of pushback, of preparedness, of the fire that comes when truth refuses to stay polite. The storm Jasmine Crockett had stirred was no longer confined to viral moments or political debate. By now, it had evolved into something more dangerous to the Trump machine. It had become a movement, not organized in the traditional sense, not confined to one policy or issue, but alive. It pulsed through the veins of a younger, sharper, louder electorate that didn't want compromise. They wanted confrontation with the truth. Trump knew it. He wasn't just losing control of the narrative. He was losing the ability to define who was credible and who wasn't. And that kind of erosion, for a man built on image, was intolerable. That's when he launched the counterattack. At a packed rally in Phoenix, Trump opened his speech not with policy, not with attacks on Biden, but with a segment titled, "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" His campaign had pieced together every video of her, spliced, edited, out of context, into a bizarre montage. In some clips, she was raising her voice. In others, animated, passionate, forceful. To his base, it was red meat. But to everyone else watching, it was grotesque. The images were paired with sinister music, overlaid with graphics suggesting chaos, instability, lawlessness. The crowd roared. But the moment the footage hit the internet, a wave of fury broke loose. People saw it for what it was, a desperate man, punching down, and not just down, sideways, backwards, wildly. Crockett responded not on TV, not in a press release, but on a college campus. She'd been invited to speak at Howard University's law school, and the timing couldn't have been more fitting. She arrived in a charcoal blazer, carrying no notes, and stood behind a plain wooden podium. You ever notice how the people who shout the most about law and order never actually studied law? She began to laughter. We've reached a moment in this country where folks think loud means wrong. But I'm not loud. I'm clear. And the truth doesn't stutter. Her speech was streamed live. Over 3.5 million views in 24 hours. And this time, she went further. She revealed threats. Real ones. Emails, voicemails, DMs, all from Trump supporters. Death threats, racial slurs, threats to her family. She read one out loud, word for word, then paused. They want to scare me silent. But see, I come from a place where we don't get quiet. We get strategic. That's when she dropped the bombshell. Jasmine Crockett had filed a formal ethics complaint, not against Trump, but against sitting members of Congress who had publicly encouraged or amplified rhetoric threatening her safety. She named names, one by one. Rep. Paul Gosar. Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene. Rep. Andy Biggs. Not for speech, for incitement, for conspiracy theories, for platforming violent imagery of elected officials. Within 48 hours, the Capitol Police increased her security detail. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus stood behind her at a press conference, unified and unflinching. It was no longer about Melania. It was about the line, and who had finally decided enough was enough. Meanwhile, Melania herself had gone quiet again, but reports began surfacing, unconfirmed but persistent, that she was deeply frustrated with how Trump had handled the backlash. She'd reportedly told a close friend, "He thinks the problem is Jasmine's tone. I think the problem is his silence when it mattered." The public wouldn't hear from her again for months. But Jasmine? Jasmine was only getting louder. She launched a national tour called Read the Record, traveling from city to city, holding town halls not to campaign, but to explain the voting record of every member of Congress who had either attacked her or tried to downplay her contributions. She showed video, receipts, side-by-side comparisons. In Detroit, she stood before a room of 600 young voters and played a clip of a representative mocking her education, then paused it and pulled up the man's resume. Let's be clear. This man, who barely passed his business ethics course, wants to lecture me, a practicing attorney, about professionalism. Y'all, they've mistaken whiteness for expertise again. The room erupted. So did Twitter. #RedThereCord trended for 3 straight days. But the movement hit another level when Crockett announced the formation of a PAC. By us, for us, an unapologetically Black, woman-led organization to fund progressive candidates of color, support grassroots legal education programs, and hold media accountable for double standards in political coverage. The launch was covered by CNN, MSNBC, and even the New York Times. One reporter asked her bluntly, "Do you think you're becoming too powerful too fast?" She smiled. Too powerful for who? And that was the moment. Right there. The Crockett movement was no longer reactive. It wasn't about pushing back on Trump. It was about pushing forward, into rooms traditionally closed off, onto ballots historically white, into conversations long dominated by the same 5 pundits. Even former President Obama, who had kept his distance from day-to-day political drama, released a statement of support. Congresswoman Crockett reminds us what courage looks like, not when it's convenient, but when it's necessary. Meanwhile, Trump's team scrambled. Poll numbers among suburban women dropped again. His advisors urged him to stop referencing Crockett altogether, saying it only makes her more powerful. He ignored them. At a rally in Pennsylvania, he lashed out again, this time ranting about how the media is making Jasmine Crockett into some kind of hero just because she yelled on TV. The problem? Video immediately surfaced of Trump himself shouting at reporters, mocking disabled people, berating women, all while the crowd cheered. The hypocrisy was too obvious to ignore. Late-night comedians pounced. Trevor Noah ran a segment titled, "Shout Like a Man, Get Applause. Shout Like a Woman, Get Investigated." John Oliver did a breakdown of how many times Trump had yelled, cursed, or thrown insults at opponents, juxtaposed with Crockett's composed, articulate remarks under pressure. Even Fox News struggled. While primetime hosts still attacked Crockett, their daytime anchors, particularly women, grew visibly uncomfortable. One host even asked on air, "Why is it worse for her to speak passionately than it is for some of our elected men to scream at reporters?" The mask was slipping. And then, in the biggest twist yet, Jasmine Crockett went one step further. She accepted an invitation to debate, not in Congress, not on a network, but at Oxford University. A formal debate, broadcast worldwide, on the motion, "The modern political establishment uses image to undermine substance." Her opponent? A conservative British commentator known for defending Trump and mocking woke politicians. The debate was electric. Crockett opened calmly, referencing Melania, the attacks, and how media had attempted to frame her voice as dangerous while ignoring the content of her arguments. Then, with surgical precision, she dismantled her opponent's examples, using legal precedent, political science data, and cultural history. Her closing words? "The danger isn't that some of us are too loud. The danger is that too many people have mistaken quiet complicity for peace. I refuse that lie. I was sent here not to sound comfortable, but to sound the alarm." When the votes were tallied, the audience overwhelmingly sided with Crockett's position. Clips from the debate flooded social media, with one phrase taking root as a rallying cry: "Sound the alarm." It appeared on t-shirts, murals, protest signs, book covers. The movement had a name now, a pulse, a voice. And Donald Trump, once the master of narrative, found himself struggling to compete with a woman who wasn't just unafraid, she was unflinching. The echoes of Jasmine Crockett's rise were no longer confined to debate stages, TikTok clips, or DC corridors. Something seismic had shifted. Her confrontation with Trump wasn't just a moment in a political news cycle. It had become a pivot in the country's cultural architecture. By the time 2025 arrived, the movement that Crockett sparked was no longer orbiting the conversation. It was the conversation. Cable news, desperate for relevance, still tried to manufacture outrage. They aired old clips of Crockett raising her voice in congressional hearings and speculated on whether she was too aggressive to be taken seriously on a national level. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. Not after what happened next. At a town hall in Atlanta, a young black girl, maybe 12 years old, stood up during the Q&A and asked, "Ms. Crockett, do you ever get scared to tell the truth when people get so mad at you for it?" The room held its breath. Crockett knelt beside her, looked her in the eye, and said, "Every day, baby. But I tell the truth anyway, because silence don't save us." That clip went viral. Again. But this time, it didn't stop on social media. It ended up in a Nike ad, in a Super Bowl commercial, in classrooms, in art installations, and on the walls of youth centers across the country. That one quote, "Silence don't save us," became the unofficial motto of an entire generation of activists. And then, Crockett made the most unexpected move of all. She announced she would not seek re-election in Congress. The political world reeled. Pundits speculated she was angling for a cable news contract, or perhaps a high-profile book deal. But Jasmine made it clear in her press conference that she wasn't stepping down from power. She was stepping into a different kind of leadership. "I've spent years playing defense, against lies, against bigotry, against corruption. Now I'm building the offense, from the outside." She unveiled a new organization, The Block, an intersectional political power engine, part legal advocacy, part campaign war room, part civic education network. Its mission? Not just to elect candidates, but to train them. Not just to fight cases, but to win public opinion, not just to represent communities, but to weaponize truth in real time. And it hit hard. The bloc was behind surprise victories in local elections across Georgia, Texas, and Michigan. It trained public defenders to run for prosecutor roles. It helped oust school board members who had pushed book bans. And it pumped millions into legal challenges to voter suppression laws, not in blue states, but in the reddest corners of the country. Meanwhile, Trump was unraveling. His 2024 loss had left him bitter and frantic. He launched Truth Social 2.0, doubled down on election lies, and cycled through legal teams like paper towels. Every few weeks, a new indictment, a new deposition, a new distraction. And yet, one thing remained constant: his obsession with Crockett. He couldn't let her go. Every rally included a jab, every press statement a veiled insult. He even claimed, absurdly, that Crockett had teamed up with the deep state to silence Melania. It was too much, even for some of his loyalists. In private, sources said Melania was mortified by the way her name was continually dragged into attacks against a woman who, by all objective measures, had handled herself with far more dignity than Trump himself. In fact, weeks later, she appeared at a charity gala for women's legal education, where Jasmine Crockett was the keynote speaker. When Crockett took the stage, she didn't acknowledge Melania by name. She didn't have to, because Melania stood up, and the entire room followed. It was a symbolic moment, one that didn't need commentary, just silence. Not the kind that hides truth, the kind that confirms it. But Crockett didn't just stop at symbolic gestures. She launched the Index, an online, publicly accessible tracker of every lie spoken by elected officials on camera, matched with side-by-side fact-checking and policy consequences. It was brutal. It was accurate. It was addictive. No longer could lawmakers lie freely without consequence. Their speeches, tweets, and statements were logged, tagged, indexed, and rated, and the platform exploded. Millions used it. College students cited it. Political opponents dreaded it. Trump, of course, landed on the homepage almost daily. One of the most viral entries? His reaction to Crockett's original Melania remarks, juxtaposed with video of him mocking women in interviews, bragging on the Access Hollywood tape, and dismissing sexual assault allegations. The hypocrisy was glaring. But here's where things turned poetic. Crockett, in her final interview before stepping away from Congress, was asked, "Do you think Donald Trump will ever stop trying to tear you down?" She answered without blinking, "He doesn't hate me. He fears me. And that's the difference." The interviewer blinked. "Why does he fear you?" Jasmine leaned in. "Because I'm not playing the game. I'm rewriting the rules." And that was the end of the beginning. In a year where chaos was sold as strategy and noise passed for leadership, Crockett reminded people that clarity was power, that directness was not aggression, that honesty didn't need to sound polished to be righteous. Her story didn't end with one viral moment, or a congressional hearing, or a soundbite about Melania. It continued in every young woman who saw themselves in her, in every law student who stopped second-guessing their voice, in every voter who started asking not just what politicians believed, but how they behaved. And in the quietest moment of the loudest campaign season, something truly rare happened. Truth won. Not with violence, not with vengeance, but with volume, the righteous kind. And as Jasmine Crockett walked off the national stage, she wasn't diminished. She was everywhere.